welcome to the Far and Near podcast. I'm Dave Poole.
And I'm Jim Hickey.
So, the intent of our podcast here is just what the title says. Jim and I both have traveled far and near and have a lot of life experiences that we've run into wonderful people and wonderful things, and we want to share some of those with you, as well as some things that are near, as in the Mount Pleasant area, Charleston, South Carolina area in which we live.
We intend this series of podcasts to explore a lot of different things, both far and near, and a few other things along the way, just to take a look at the human condition, what people are doing, what they're saying, what their hobbies are, what their dreams and desires are. We just want to talk to a lot of people and learn their stories. Everybody has a story. Don't you believe that, Dave?
No, absolutely. I know, the thing that always amazes me is when you talk to people, that most people are just dying to get their story out there. They want somebody to hear their story, that they're valuable, that they've got something that they've contributed to life. And I know I've been fortunate enough to run across so many wonderful people over the years that have such interesting stories, way more interesting than anything that I've done in my life.
And not to sound too aggressive, but what's your story, Dave?
Well, my story is I get bored easily.
Okay.
So I'm always looking for something new and wonderful to experience. And, I've music has been a big central part of my life, including having met you through music. We have mutual friends that were at one point looking for a secondary drummer to fill in when the primary drummer couldn't be there. And then that has led to me being the primary drummer for the band now. And
yes, we are in a band. That's the big thing we want to tell you about right now.
Yep.
Dave and I both belong to a band here in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. And because we are all of a certain age, if you catch my drift, we call the band 40 Years Too Late. I guess we just figured that the music we should have played in our 20s and 30s, we're now playing in our 60s and 70s, and we love it. I'm the bass player, Dave's the drummer. We have a lead guitar. We have a rhythm guitar and male vocal and a female vocal, and we have a lot of fun.
Yeah, and it's, we should point out for Crystal's benefit that not all of us are of a certain age.
Okay, yeah, and Crystal is not our daughter. In fact, you'll see why people ask if Crystal is our daughter when we take a look at this clip. And that's 40 Years Too Late. We do have fun.
We do have a lot of fun, and that's the important thing. I know we recently played a gig at the Isle of Palms VFW post.
Oh, that was great.
And first of all, marvelous view. It's on the back deck overlooking
the Atlantic Ocean.
The Atlantic Ocean, the Isle of Palm Beach, the front beach, they call it. We're next to the Windjammer, where a lot of other great music is played there. But primarily, we were able to play for all of these veterans and their families.
What a privilege!
It really was, and they were just so appreciative. I remember in particular, I can't remember the young girl's name, but there was a young girl who was, I believe, had Down syndrome.
Oh yes,
who just was thrilled to get up and dance.
She was so fun.
She's just had a great time, and at least I had a great time watching her. I'm sure the other guys did as well.
And let us take the opportunity now on this podcast, since we're talking about the VFW, to thank all the service people out there, men and women. Thank you all for your service. We do appreciate it.
Yep,
we really do.
Absolutely. It's a country that way too many of us take for granted on every day, and it's largely through efforts of those folks that keep us safe, keep us in this great democracy, this great republic in which we live.
It just occurred to me, we do have service people who are here in the Charleston area, particularly in the Air Force, who fly the huge, big C-17 cargo aircraft carriers. Perhaps we can, down the road, talk to one of those folks about their experience.
Yeah,
because they have flown from here to Afghanistan. They've flown from here all over the world. I'd love to hear their stories.
Yeah,
we'll look into that down the road.
Absolutely. So I know, Jim has a great set of travel experiences in his days as a correspondent for ABC News. How did you get around? I mean, were you primarily commercial? Did you ever hop on a military aircraft to get from point A to point B?
Yeah, I did. In fact, on some occasions, I covered Desert Storm and flew from Kuwait to Saudi Arabia in a C-130 airplane. Uh, really quick story about that is that, of course, it was a combination of armed forces in Desert Storm led by the United States, but there were other countries involved, including the Air Force from New Zealand, of all places. They were there with their cargo planes, the C-130s. And after being in Kuwait for a number of weeks, it was left up to us to find our way back to Saudi Arabia. There were no commercial flights because there was a war going on. So I hitched a ride on one of these C-130s that was being flown by the pilots of the New Zealand Air Force. And it was the first time they were in country. So we got all strapped into the back of the plane and we took off. And I looked out the window and I noticed that we were, in my view, perilously close to the buildings and the religious symbols around Kuwait. I went up to the cockpit and I found the crew had put the plane on autopilot and were circling around and around the city, and they were all taking pictures out the window so they could take these pictures back home. And I said, guys, who's flying the plane? And they said, hey, don't worry, mate. We got it covered. And off we went. That was quite an experience. So, yeah, I have flown in military aircraft. I once flew, not once, but twice, flew with Pope John Paul, 3 times with Pope John Paul II. One of those times, and this is a story perhaps for another time, one of those was in a Concorde. An Air France Concorde jet, we flew from the island of Reunion in the Indian Ocean to Lusaka, Zambia. And that was quite an adventure as well. So, yeah, I've flown a lot of different planes.
Yeah, I'm not sure I could even spell a couple of those places. So so that's interesting. I know, I've never flown on a military aircraft, but flying in and out of Charleston a lot for my business career. Every time we'd land on the main runway here in Charleston, which shares the commercial airport shares runways with the military aircraft, there are, I'm going to guess, 35, maybe 40 of these C-17s that you mentioned.
They're huge.
Lined up, and you don't get at least I didn't get a great perspective on just how big these planes are until we went by there on a daytime landing, and you see people walking around loading things in there, and you realize that the tops of these planes are probably 10 people high.
Yeah.
They're probably 60, 70, 80 feet in the air or something like that.
Well, I have a confession to make. I will confess that I pulled a really bad faux pas involving the C-17s, and I guess I'm making it public because I want to make amends.
And the statute of limitations has probably run out.
Limitations has run out. There was an air show at the Charleston airport, and some of these huge C-17 aircraft were on display. You could go through the plane and take a look. And they had service people, Air Force personnel there, explaining the purpose of the plane and how they work. And at this one table outside the plane, there was this young woman in uniform, very short young woman, explaining the whole purpose of the plane and how it was built and how it is flown and all the details. It's fascinating. So I said to her at one point, oh, are you one of the crew? And she gave me this look and said, I'm the pilot. I went, oh, my apologies.
Sorry about that.
How sexist of me was that? To not even think that she was the pilot. So I apologize. She was the pilot. Not only was she the pilot, she was the instructor pilot for the others. And so these are the kind of people that we want to meet and talk to in this podcast. People who have unusual jobs, who do unusual things, and have unusual stories to tell.
Yeah, and I count myself very fortunate to having come from such a rural area, literally on the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, to have met such interesting folks. And for me, that original story of really becoming more worldly, in my view, is in Chillicothe, Ohio. There's a very large paper mill that's been owned and operated by various companies over the years, but primarily known as the Mead Corporation, or as the locals call it, the Mead. But within that complex, there is a building that housed something called Meade's Central Research Department.
Hmm.
So this is where we would do various experiments on how to make paper better, faster, cheaper, how to make different types of paper, all that sort of thing. And it was
And chemicals were involved, yes?
chemicals involved, and we'll talk about that in a second. But probably 125 people there at a given time,
Okay.
employed there,
All right.
most of which were foreign nationals of some sort that had come to Chillicothe, Ohio, of all places, to collaborate on making better paper. But but we had Israelis, Russians, Chinese, Japanese, fella from Taiwan, a couple of Canadians, a couple of Mexicans. Just a very diverse workforce that I'd never been exposed to. Growing up where I grew up, predominantly white. I think we had my graduating class in high school had about 100 kids, something
Mhm.
like that.
Small.
In our entire school, we might have had 5 black kids total. So let alone somebody from another country.
Right.
So this was all very new to me, and I thank that experience for really opening my eyes to what could be out there. Now Jim mentions chemicals, and obviously there are chemicals in a research lab. One of the stories you covered goes back, I guess now, what would that be, 40 years now?
About that, yep.
Was in Bhopal, India.
Bhopal, India. I lived and worked overseas in Europe and Africa for about 10 years during the 80s. And in 1984, there was this terrible chemical leak at a Union Carbide plant in Bhopal, India, which is several hundred miles south of New Delhi. This chemical leak killed thousands of people and caused a great deal of harm. And I was sent to Bhopal with a film crew to cover this story, and realized very quickly how dangerous and how awful this story was. It resulted in lawsuits, and people had to leave. Actually, not had to leave. They fled the city in order to get away from this gas that was seeping through this town of Bhopal. Let's take a look at one of those stories.
Round after round of rockets rained down from the mountains on pro-Arafat fighters today. It was the heaviest concentration of shelling by Syrian-supported PLO rebels so far. Arafat al-Fatah loyalists fired back with heavy barrages of their own, but they are no match for the superior rebel firepower. Even Arafat's military commander, Abu Jiyad, is astounded by the intensity of the attacks, which he says are orchestrated by Syrian officers.
You see, this heavy power, which they haven't used against the Israelis, you see. Yes, when we were under the siege in Beirut, we were looking for like this power to help us and to support us, but alas, we haven't that, you see.
Fatah field commanders concede they can hold out here for only so long, and that it's just a matter of time before they pull back into the city of Tripoli and do their fighting there.
Start again. It was really a sad story, Dave, and unfortunately, even today, 40 years later, some people are still feeling the effects of that gas leak.
Yeah, I had, when we were preparing for this podcast, I had looked through those, that clip that we just showed, and it just struck me as how helpless people felt at the time, and the things that they felt like they weren't being told.
That was part of the problem. What they weren't being told, part of the reason they weren't being told is that the officials who should have known, they didn't know what
they didn't know what to tell.
They didn't know what to tell them.
Yeah.
It was an awful situation.
Yeah, and I grew up, like I said, in southeastern Ohio, not too far from the West Virginia Ohio line. And if you make that drive down through West Virginia on US Route 35, you go, and I cannot for the life of me remember the name of the river. I'll remember it here in a little bit, I'm sure. But there's a main river that kind of runs through the middle of West Virginia, and it's lined with chemical plants.
Right. It's not the same river where 3 Mile Island is
No,
located.
it is not.
Because I ask that because everybody, that's a generalized statement, a lot of people remember 3 Mile Island and the nuclear power plant leak there. And I happened to be working at a television station in Philadelphia at the time, KYW TV. And we covered 3 Mile Island. And, again, We had no idea. People had no idea at the time the risk involved. We flew from Philadelphia to 3 Mile Island in a helicopter in order to get aerial shots and to arrive there quickly. When we arrived, we circled the cooling towers and the helicopter in order to get our aerial shots of the area. Little did we know that the steam coming out of those cooling towers was radioactive. We didn't learn that until we hit the ground, and that was pretty frightening. Fortunately, we're okay. At least I think we are.
You're here.
Yeah, we're here.
Yeah, that starts, a good conversation. At least you survived it. But yeah, so we've both been through a good number of places in our lives. We've got some good stories to tell, and some people we'll bring on board here to share their stories. Also, Charleston, Mount Pleasant, South Carolina area, great place for people to move to, whether it's retirees, later in life folks like us, or if it's people coming here. There's a great healthcare facility here called MUSC, Medical University of South Carolina. It's a great teaching hospital. So there's a good bit of healthcare work that's done here.
So stay with us as we explore events and things and talk to people both far and near. We'll see you next time.
Look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, guys. Hey, thanks for joining us here at Our 20 Days. We appreciate the time that you invest in our videos and audio podcasts. If you'd like to go to our20days.com, you can join as a member and you'll be notified every week of new content. And we'd sincerely appreciate that. Thanks and have a great day.